The moment the judge asked whether I objected to the transfer of the inheritance, the entire courtroom turned toward me. My younger sister Rachel sat across the aisle with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from believing victory is already yours. Our parents sat beside her, both of them watching me with the same expectation I had seen all my life. They believed this was the moment when I would finally lose. Their lawyer, Daniel Whitaker, stood near the table with a folder full of neatly organized documents. He spoke clearly so the judge could record every word. "The Mercer estate will transfer in full to Rachel Mercer," he said. "Ms. Natalie Mercer has agreed to relinquish all claims to the inheritance." My mother nodded with satisfaction. My father folded his arms like a man who had finally settled an argument that had lasted too long. Rachel leaned back in her chair and smiled at me across the room. "You finally understand?" she said quietly. The judge slid the document toward me. All I had to do was sign. The pen felt light in my hand as I looked down at the page. 40 acres of forest land outside Asheville. The farmhouse my grandmother built her life around. The small maple cooperative that had supported local families for years. Everything would belong to Rachel now. I signed my name. Whitaker gathered the papers and announced it for the court record. "The inheritance is officially transferred." That was when I smiled. Rachel noticed it immediately. "What's so funny?" she asked. I looked at the folder of documents her lawyer had just closed and asked the only question that mattered. "Did you calculate the cost of ownership?" The Buncombe County courtroom was quiet enough that every small movement sounded louder than usual. The scrape of a chair, the shuffle of papers, the faint creak of the wooden benches behind us. I had spent most of the hearing watching the sunlight fall through the tall courthouse windows. It painted narrow strips of gold across the floor, cutting between the tables where our family sat like two opposing sides of a business negotiation. In a way, that was exactly what it had become. A family inheritance turned into a legal dispute. I was 32 years old, and the land my grandmother left behind had become the center of a family drama none of us could pretend to ignore anymore. Across from me, Rachel looked relaxed in a way I had not seen in years. At 29, she had always carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed life would eventually reward her. Today, she believed that reward had finally arrived. Our parents were just as convinced. My father leaned toward Rachel and whispered something that made her smile wider. My mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You finally got what was yours," my father said under his breath. I heard it clearly. Rachel's lawyer closed his briefcase with the quiet snap of finality. Daniel Whitaker had handled the entire case with the calm efficiency of a man who believed the outcome had been obvious from the start. To him, the Mercer estate was simple. A house, 40 acres of land, a small agricultural business attached to it, an inheritance dispute between two sisters. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at the documents again. "For the record," he said, "Ms. Rachel Mercer now assumes full ownership of the Mercer property, including all attached land and business interests." Rachel sat a little straighter when she heard the word ownership. That word meant everything to her. Ownership meant control. Ownership meant victory. Ownership meant she had taken something valuable away from me. Whitaker nodded confidently, clearly satisfied with the result. "Your Honor, the transfer is voluntary," he said. "Ms. Natalie Mercer has waived all rights to the inheritance." The judge looked at me briefly, perhaps expecting hesitation, but I simply nodded. "Yes," I said. The hearing ended quickly after that. The clerk began gathering paperwork while Whitaker organized the documents into his folder. Rachel stood first. She turned toward me with a small laugh, the kind someone gives when they think the argument is finally over. "You could have saved everyone a lot of time," she said. "If you had just agreed to this from the beginning." I studied my sister's face for a moment. For years she had believed I was controlling the family land. For years she thought I was holding something valuable away from her. Now she had exactly what she wanted. "You're right," I said calmly. Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that I agreed. I picked up my bag and stood from the table. I hope your lawyer explained everything that comes with ownership. I added. Rachel laughed immediately. If you're talking about taxes, she said, I think I'll manage. Behind her. Whitaker paused for a moment while sliding the documents into his briefcase. Is there something specific you're referring to? He asked. I shook my head. Nothing hidden, I said. Everything you need to know is already in those documents. Whitaker gave a polite nod, though I noticed something shift in his expression. For the first time during the entire hearing, he seemed curious about the paperwork he had just finalized. Rachel didn't notice. She was already walking toward the courtroom doors with our parents beside her. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower over the mountains. I stayed behind for a moment, gathering the last of my things from the table. The folder that had once held my grandmother's estate was gone now. Rachel owned the Mercer land, the farmhouse, the forest, the cooperative, everything. And along with it, every responsibility attached to that land. I walked out of the courtroom a minute later. Ahead of me in the hallway, Rachel was laughing with our parents, already talking about what she planned to do with the property. I wondered how long that excitement would last. Because the truth was simple. Most people only see the value of land. Very few understand the weight that comes with owning it. The courthouse steps were still warm from the afternoon sun when I walked outside. Downtown Asheville moved around me the way it always did. Cars passed along the street. A couple pushed a stroller across the crosswalk. 2 college students sat on a bench arguing about something that sounded important to them. Life continued like nothing unusual had happened. Behind me, the courthouse doors opened again and my family stepped out together. Rachel's voice carried easily across the stone steps. So when do we start talking to buyers? She asked. Their lawyer answered in a confident tone. Once the title paperwork finishes processing, you'll have full control of the property. My father laughed quietly. 40 acres outside Asheville, he said. You'll have developers lining up. Rachel sounded pleased with that thought. I stood near the bottom of the steps, pretending to search for my car keys while listening to them. Rachel added one more sentence that made me pause. I already know someone who might be interested. Whitaker sounded curious. A buyer. A developer? Rachel said. A friend in Charlotte connected me. I looked up for a moment, watching the way Rachel spoke as if the future had already been decided. The Mercer land had barely been hers for 15 minutes, and she was already planning how to sell it. I turned away and walked toward the parking lot. The mountains surrounding Asheville were faintly visible beyond the rooftops, blue and quiet in the distance. They had looked the same my entire life. The Mercer land sat just beyond those ridges. 40 acres of forest and maple groves my grandmother had protected for decades. Rachel saw opportunity. My grandmother had seen responsibility. The difference between those two ideas had shaped most of my life. The Mercer property had been in our family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather bought the land long before Asheville started expanding west toward the mountains. Back then, it had been nothing more than a modest farmhouse surrounded by thick Appalachian forest. By the time my grandmother Eleanor inherited it, developers were already moving into the region. She spent most of her life fighting to keep the land the way it was. The farmhouse itself wasn't large or particularly modern. It was a weathered wooden structure built sometime in the 1930s, sitting at the edge of a clearing surrounded by tall maples and oak trees. But the land around it was valuable in ways most people didn't understand. During the winter months, local families collected sap from the maple trees and produced small batches of syrup through a cooperative my grandmother helped organize years earlier. It wasn't a large business. It was barely profitable most years, but it kept the land active, protected, and connected to the community around it. My grandmother used to say the forest worked best when people respected it instead of trying to control it. Rachel had never understood that idea. 2 summers earlier, she visited the property for the first time in almost a year. She walked through the grove while workers collected sap from the trees. Plastic lines stretching quietly from trunk to trunk. Rachel looked around for a while, studying the hills. Then she asked the question that had unsettled my grandmother more than anything else. Why haven't you sold this place already? My grandmother had been standing beside me on the porch when Rachel asked that. She didn't answer immediately. She simply watched the trees for a moment before turning back to Rachel. "Because it isn't meant to be sold," she said calmly. Rachel laughed like she thought the answer was sentimental. "Everything gets sold eventually." That had been Rachel's way of thinking for as long as I could remember. Growing up, she had always been the one our parents praised. Rachel was outgoing, confident, and good at convincing people she deserved whatever she wanted. Teachers loved her. Neighbors admired her. Our parents talked about her future like it was already guaranteed. I was the practical one, the one who helped my grandmother manage the property during summers instead of going on trips with friends. The one who stayed home after college to help organize the estate paperwork when my grandmother's health started declining. My parents often described Rachel as ambitious. They described me as reliable. There's a difference between those words that most families pretend not to notice. I remembered one Thanksgiving dinner when relatives asked my father what his daughters planned to do with their lives. "Rachel's going to build something big," he said proudly. "Someone asked about me." My mother smiled politely. "Natalie will always help the family." At the time, I didn't think much about the comment. Helping the family eventually meant helping my grandmother manage everything connected to the land. Permits, taxes, partnership agreements with the cooperative families, environmental reports required by the state, paperwork stacked in filing cabinets inside the small office off the farmhouse kitchen. Most of it wasn't exciting work, but it mattered. My grandmother believed the land needed someone willing to protect it from people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at a forest. Rachel saw those dollar signs the moment she looked at the property. Now she finally owned it. I reached my car and unlocked the door, tossing my bag into the passenger seat. Across the parking lot, I could still hear Rachel talking with our parents. They sounded excited, already discussing future plans for the land. "Once we sell it," Rachel said loudly, "everything will finally be fair." I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. The engine started with a quiet hum. For a moment, I pictured the filing cabinets back at the farmhouse, filled with documents my grandmother had spent years organizing. Most people see land and think about value. Very few think about the responsibilities hidden behind the title. Rachel had spent months fighting to win the Mercer inheritance. Now she finally had it. And she still believed she had won something simple. The road out of Asheville curved slowly into the hills, and by the time the city disappeared behind me, the air already felt quieter. Driving always helped me think, especially when the road led toward the mountains. For years, that drive had meant returning to the Mercer property. I knew every turn of the road that led toward the farmhouse, every stretch of forest that signaled I was getting close. This time I kept driving past the turn. The land wasn't mine anymore. Rachel owned it now. I wondered if she had even looked through the files yet. Because if she had, the excitement she showed outside the courthouse would not have lasted long. For most people, inheritance means receiving something simple. Money, a house, a piece of land. But the Mercer estate had never been simple. My grandmother Eleanor understood that better than anyone. 3 years earlier, I had spent most evenings in the small office off the farmhouse kitchen organizing her paperwork. The room smelled like old wood and paper, and the window overlooked the maple grove where the cooperative workers set up their sap lines every winter. The office wasn't large, but it held the most important part of the property. 4 tall filing cabinets lined the wall, each drawer labeled carefully in my grandmother's handwriting. Property taxes, agricultural permits, cooperative agreements, environmental reports, legal covenants. Most visitors to the farmhouse never saw those cabinets. They only saw the porch, the forest, and the quiet hills surrounding the land. But my grandmother always said the paperwork mattered just as much as the trees. One evening I had been sitting at the desk going through a thick stack of documents when I noticed a folder I hadn't seen before. The label read, "Transfer of Stewardship Obligations." I opened it expecting something routine. Instead, I found a set of agreements my grandmother had signed nearly 15 years earlier. The papers described the conservation program protecting the forest on our property. At the time, Several landowners across western North Carolina had worked with the state to preserve large sections of mountain forest from development. My grandmother had been one of them. The agreement restricted construction on the land. No commercial resorts, no subdivisions, no large-scale development projects. The forest had to remain intact. At first, I thought the document only applied while my grandmother owned the property. Then I reached the final page. There, printed clearly in legal language, was a clause that changed everything. All stewardship responsibilities transfer automatically to any successor owner. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Ownership of the Mercer land meant inheriting more than the property itself. It meant inheriting every obligation attached to protecting it. The next day I asked my grandmother about it while we sat on the porch, watching the late afternoon sunlight fall through the trees. What happens if someone ignores these obligations? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out across the forest like she was remembering something from years earlier. "The state won't ignore it," she said calmly. "They'll fine the owner until the property collapses under the weight of it." Her tone wasn't angry. It was simply factual. At the time, I didn't think much about that answer. I assumed whoever inherited the land would respect what my grandmother built. Now I realized how naive that assumption had been. Rachel never cared about the paperwork. 2 summers earlier, she visited the farmhouse while I was helping the cooperative workers prepare the equipment for the coming winter season. Sap lines stretched between the trees. Clear tubing glistening in the sunlight as it connected dozens of maples across the hillside. Rachel walked through the grove with the curious expression of someone evaluating a business opportunity. She stopped beside one of the trees and looked across the valley. 40 acres out here," she said. "This has to be worth a fortune." I explained the conservation agreement. The land was protected. Development was restricted. The cooperative depended on maintaining the forest ecosystem. Rachel listened quietly for a moment before laughing. "Nothing's impossible if the price is high enough," she said. I remember looking at her and realizing she didn't believe a single word I had said. She saw land. She saw money. The legal structure surrounding the property meant nothing to her. That conversation came back to me now as I parked in my driveway. Inside the house, I placed a familiar binder on the kitchen table. It was one of the estate files I had kept copies of for my own records. The binder was thick with documents, tax filings, environmental compliance reports, inspection schedules, restoration plans for the aging farmhouse. I opened it slowly, flipping through pages I had memorized over the years. Near the back was the conservation agreement. My grandmother's signature sat neatly at the bottom of the page. Beneath it was the clause that mattered most. All stewardship responsibilities transfer automatically to any successor owner. Rachel Mercer was now that owner, which meant the erosion control project scheduled for next year belonged to her. The wildlife monitoring reports belonged to her. The farmhouse foundation repairs belonged to her. And the cooperative agreements with the neighboring families belonged to her too. I closed the binder and leaned back in my chair. Across town, Rachel was probably still celebrating her victory. She thought the inheritance meant wealth. The truth was much simpler. The Mercer land had never been a reward. It had always been a responsibility. And Rachel had just signed her name to every page of it. The first accusation came 2 days after my grandmother's funeral. The house was quiet by then. Most of the relatives had already left town, and the casseroles neighbors brought over were stacked in the refrigerator like a small monument to Southern sympathy. Only 4 of us remained in the farmhouse kitchen. Rachel stood near the counter holding a thin folder of estate papers. My parents sat at the table, watching both of us with the kind of tension that comes when people already believe they know the outcome of an argument. I was washing the last of the coffee mugs when Rachel finally spoke. "So how long were you planning to keep controlling everything?" she asked. I turned around slowly. "Controlling what?" Rachel lifted the folder slightly. "The property. The cooperative. The accounts. All of it." Her tone sounded calm, but the accusation inside it was clear. For a moment I thought she was joking. My grandmother had only been gone for 3 days, but Rachel's expression told me she was completely serious. "I've been managing the paperwork," I said carefully. Grandma asked me to help with that years ago. Rachel let out a short laugh. That's convenient. My mother shifted in her chair. Rachel has a point, she said. You've been making decisions about the property for a long time. I looked at her, surprised. Most of those decisions were things that had to be done, I said. Taxes, permits, environmental reports. Rachel interrupted before I could continue. And somehow I was never included in any of that. My father leaned forward. She deserves to be involved, he said. I felt the conversation sliding into a direction that didn't make sense. You live 3 hours away? I said to Rachel. You barely come here. That doesn't mean you get to run everything, she replied. The argument moved quickly after that. Rachel began listing grievances like she had been rehearsing them for weeks. She said I kept the financial records private. She said I made decisions about the cooperative without consulting anyone. She said the property was family inheritance, not my personal responsibility. Each accusation landed in the room like a small explosion. I tried to explain the truth. Most of the work connected to the land wasn't about control. It was administrative. The conservation agreement required annual reports to the state. The cooperative needed permits to operate. The property taxes had to be filed correctly every year. Rachel waved away the explanation like it was irrelevant. You're missing the point, she said. What point? That you've been acting like the land belongs to you. My father nodded slowly. We just want things to be fair, he said. Fair. That word settled heavily in the room. Rachel stepped closer to the table and placed the folder in front of my parents. Inside were copies of property records and financial summaries I had provided to the estate attorney after my grandmother's death. Rachel tapped the papers with her finger. You've had access to everything, she said. And you expect us to believe you weren't using that control to your advantage. I stared at her. Advantage. Rachel leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. If you won't share control, she said, I'll get it through the courts. The room fell silent. At the time, I assumed it was just anger talking. Families argue after funerals all the time. People say things they don't really mean. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at my house. Inside was a formal notice from the county court. Rachel Mercer had filed a legal claim challenging my authority over the Mercer estate. The document stated that I had manipulated estate management to exclude other heirs. The claim demanded full transfer of ownership rights. I remember sitting at the kitchen table reading the letter twice before the meaning fully settled in. Rachel hadn't been speaking emotionally. She had already decided to fight. The first mediation meeting happened a month later. That was the day I met Daniel Whitaker. He was younger than I expected, with the confident posture of someone who believed he understood exactly how the case would end. Whitaker laid out Rachel's argument clearly. She had been excluded from decisions about the property. She had been denied access to financial records. She deserved equal authority over the inheritance. While he spoke, I noticed the way he framed the property. He asked questions about market value. He asked how much the land might sell for. He asked whether development could increase its financial potential. What he didn't ask about were the conservation agreements, or the environmental permits, or the cooperative contracts. At one point, he looked at me across the table. 40 acres outside Asheville, he said thoughtfully. That land must be worth quite a bit. It depends what you plan to do with it, I replied. Whitaker smiled. Most restrictions can be renegotiated. I didn't correct him. By then, I had already started to suspect something. A week later, I saw the proof in a stack of documents exchanged during the legal discovery process. One email caught my attention. It came from a real estate consultant advising Rachel. The message discussed potential development value for the Mercer property. One line stood out clearly. This property could be worth several $1 million if development rights are secured. If? I stared at the word for a long time. Rachel wasn't fighting for the land. She was fighting for the money she believed the land would bring. And the lawyer helping her had never taken the time to understand the difference. Months later, when my own attorney told me the case was weak and we would probably win in court, I asked him a question that caught him completely off guard. What happens if I don't fight it? I asked. He looked confused. You mean settle? No, I said. Let them take the inheritance. He stared at me like I had just suggested giving away a winning lottery ticket. The property is valuable, he said carefully. I thought about the filing cabinets in my grandmother's office, about the conservation agreements, about the cooperative contracts, about the responsibilities tied to every acre of that forest. Not in the way they think, I said quietly. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper when the judge returned to his seat. By then, the hearing had already lasted almost an hour, though it felt shorter than that. Most of the time had been spent reviewing documents and confirming the legal structure of the estate. Rachel sat across from me with the calm confidence of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. My parents watched the judge carefully, both of them leaning forward as if the final decision might change at the last second. It wouldn't. The decision had already been made the moment I chose not to fight. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the final pages of the estate transfer agreement. Ms. Rachel Mercer, he said. You understand that the property, including the residential structure and surrounding land, will transfer entirely into your name. Rachel nodded immediately. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned toward me. And Ms. Natalie Mercer, you confirm that you are relinquishing all claims to the Mercer estate. I do, I said. My own lawyer glanced at me briefly, still unsure whether I fully understood what I was giving up. But I did, better than anyone in that room. The court clerk brought the final documents forward and placed them on the table between us. It was a thick packet of legal pages held together by a silver binder clip. Rachel flipped through the first few sheets quickly, her eyes searching for the signature lines. I noticed she skipped almost everything else. I picked up the pen first. The paper felt strangely ordinary beneath my hand. Years of family conflict reduced to a few paragraphs of legal language. I signed my name slowly across the bottom of the waiver. Natalie Mercer. Just like that. Every legal connection I had to the property disappeared. Rachel signed next. Her signature was faster, almost excited. When she finished, she pushed the document toward her lawyer. Whitaker gathered the pages neatly and stood to address the judge. For the record, he said confidently, the Mercer estate is now fully transferred to Rachel Mercer. Ms. Natalie Mercer has voluntarily waived all ownership claims. He emphasized the word voluntarily. The judge nodded and made a final note in the file. Rachel leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile. My mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. My father looked toward me for a moment, his expression somewhere between relief and quiet triumph. You finally got what was yours, he whispered to Rachel. Rachel laughed softly. For them, this had never really been about the land. It was about winning. Whitaker closed the folder containing the estate documents and began placing the papers into his briefcase. As he did, a loose sheet briefly slid from the back of the stack. I recognized it immediately. The summary page from the conservation agreement. The page outlining the environmental stewardship responsibilities attached to the property. Whitaker glanced at it for less than a second before sliding it back into the folder. He hadn't read it. Not carefully. The judge stood, signaling the hearing was finished. That concludes this matter, he said. Chairs scraped quietly as people stood. Rachel gathered her purse and turned toward me. You could have saved everyone a lot of time, she said lightly, if you'd just agreed to this from the start. I studied her for a moment. For months she had believed I was holding something valuable away from her. Now she finally had it. You're right, I said. Rachel blinked, surprised by the agreement. Behind her, Whitaker locked his briefcase and straightened his jacket. Rachel tilted her head slightly. That's it, she asked. No argument. I picked up my bag from the table. I hope your lawyer explained everything that comes with ownership, I said calmly. Rachel laughed immediately. If you're talking about taxes, she said, I think I'll survive. Her confidence echoed across the emptying courtroom. Whitaker paused for a moment. For the first time during the hearing, he looked at me with something like curiosity. Is there something specific you're referring to? He asked. I shook my head. Nothing hidden. I said. Everything you need to know is already in those documents. Whitaker nodded politely, though his eyes lingered on the briefcase for a moment. Rachel didn't notice. She was already walking toward the courtroom doors with our parents beside her. In the hallway outside, her voice carried easily. "So how long before we can start talking to buyers?" she asked. Whitaker responded confidently. "Once the title paperwork processes, you'll have full control of the property." Full control. I stayed behind for a moment, gathering the last of my things. The courtroom had emptied quickly. The judge had already disappeared through a side door. My lawyer approached me quietly. "You're sure about this?" he asked. I nodded. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the courthouse lawn. Rachel's laughter echoed faintly from the hallway. She was celebrating. They all were. From their perspective, the inheritance dispute was finally over. Rachel owned the Mercer estate, the farmhouse, the forest, the cooperative, everything. I walked out of the courtroom a minute later. Ahead of me, Rachel and my parents stood near the courthouse exit talking excitedly about plans for the property. Rachel turned when she saw me. "You really don't regret it?" she asked. I looked at her calmly. The documents in Whitaker's briefcase contained hundreds of pages of obligations tied to that land. Environmental reports, restoration schedules, conservation agreements, financial responsibilities that stretched years into the future. Rachel had just signed her name to all of them. "No," I said. Rachel shrugged and turned back toward our parents. They walked out into the sunlight together. I followed a few steps behind, already knowing something they didn't. Winning the Mercer inheritance had been easy. Owning it would be something else entirely. A week after the court ruling, the quiet in my house felt unfamiliar. For years, my mornings had started the same way. Coffee on the kitchen table, a stack of paperwork beside it, and a long list of things that needed attention before noon. Tax filings, inspection reports, emails from the cooperative families asking about the next sap collection schedule. There had always been something connected to the Mercer land that needed to be handled. That morning there was nothing. Just a notebook filled with plans for a consulting project I had recently agreed to help with. For the first time in years, the Mercer property wasn't my responsibility. Rachel owned it now. I had just finished writing a few notes when my phone vibrated against the table. The name on the screen surprised me. Daniel Whitaker, Rachel's lawyer. I stared at the phone for a moment before answering. Whitaker had been confident in court, almost dismissive whenever I tried to explain the administrative side of the estate. Something must have changed for him to call me directly. "Ms. Mercer," he said when I answered. His voice sounded different, more cautious. "Good morning," I replied. "I hope I'm not interrupting." There was a brief pause on the line before he continued. "I've been reviewing the full estate documentation from last week's transfer." I leaned back slightly in my chair. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. He had finally started reading the files. "There's a section here regarding conservation stewardship obligations," Whitaker said. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I wanted to ask if you could clarify how those requirements were managed in previous years." His tone was polite, but the question carried a hint of confusion. Whitaker sounded like a man who had just discovered something he hadn't expected. "The conservation agreement requires annual compliance reports," I said. "Those are submitted to the State Environmental Office." Another short pause. "I see," he said slowly. "And these reports are mandatory. Every year." The silence on the other end of the call lasted several seconds. When Whitaker spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. "Failure to submit them results in financial penalties." Yes. I could almost picture him sitting at his desk with the estate documents spread out in front of him, turning pages, realizing how much he had missed. "There's also a section here about forest preservation maintenance," he said. "That involves erosion control and habitat monitoring," I replied. "Those projects are scheduled through the conservation program." Whitaker cleared his throat quietly. "And the property owner is responsible for funding that work." "Yes." Another pause followed, longer this time. Whitaker finally asked the question I had been waiting for. Were you personally handling these obligations while your grandmother owned the property? Yes. I had been doing it for years. Organizing the inspections, scheduling contractors, filing the reports required to keep the conservation agreement active. Most people never noticed that work. They only saw the land itself. Whitaker exhaled slowly on the phone. I understand, he said. But his voice suggested he was still trying to understand. Then he mentioned something that made the situation clearer. Rachel attempted to contact a developer regarding the property, he said. I suspected that might happen. The developer's legal team requested documentation about the land restrictions. Whitaker hesitated before finishing the sentence. They declined to move forward. Of course they did. No serious developer would touch property tied to a conservation program like the one protecting the Mercer land. Whitaker continued flipping through the documents. There's also a restoration order related to the Farmhouse Foundation, he said. That inspection happened last year. I replied. The engineers recommended stabilization before winter. And the estimated cost? I named the number. Whitaker didn't respond immediately. The amount had shocked me the first time I saw it, too. Was Rachel aware of these obligations? He finally asked. Everything was included in the estate records, I said. That was the truth. Every document had been filed with the court during the inheritance dispute. Whitaker had simply chosen not to read them closely. He continued scanning the paperwork. There are also partnership agreements with the Maple Cooperative, he said. Yes. And those agreements require participation from the landowner. Yes. More silence. I could imagine him adding up the responsibilities. Property taxes, environmental compliance, restoration work, cooperative obligations. The Mercer land looked valuable from the outside, but maintaining it required constant attention. Whitaker spoke again, slower now. Did you manage all of this alone? For the most part. I heard him close a folder on his desk. There was one final question he needed to ask. Why didn't you mention these obligations during the court hearing? I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. No one asked. Whitaker didn't argue with that. He thanked me for the clarification and ended the call shortly afterward. The kitchen felt quiet again when I set my phone down. Outside the window, the mountains surrounding Asheville were hidden beneath a thin layer of morning fog. Somewhere across town, Rachel was probably hearing the same information her lawyer had just discovered. The inheritance she fought so hard to win wasn't a simple piece of real estate. It was a system of responsibilities that stretched far beyond the title on the property deed. I took another sip of coffee and looked down at the notebook on the table. For years, the Mercer land had shaped every part of my schedule. Now that responsibility belonged to someone else. Rachel had believed ownership meant freedom. Soon she would learn what my grandmother had always understood. Land doesn't belong to the person who wants it. It belongs to the person willing to carry the weight of it. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I was driving along a narrow mountain road outside Asheville when my phone began vibrating in the cup holder beside me. I had spent the morning meeting with a small group of landowners who wanted advice about protecting their forest from development. It was the kind of work I had always enjoyed, even back when my grandmother was alive, helping people understand what responsibility looked like before they signed anything. When the phone buzzed again, I glanced down at the screen while slowing for a curve in the road. 5 missed calls. All from Rachel. I almost didn't answer when it rang again. Rachel and I had spoken less and less over the years, especially after the inheritance dispute started. Most of our conversations had turned into arguments long before the lawsuit ever reached the courtroom. But something about the number of calls made me pick up. Hello. Rachel didn't bother with a greeting. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? She demanded. I pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the engine. Tell you about what? Rachel exhaled sharply, like she had been holding the frustration in for hours. The inspections. The reports. The repairs on the house. Every time I think I understand this property, something else shows up. Her voice sounded nothing like it had in the courthouse hallway. The confidence was gone. What happened? I asked. Rachel hesitated for a moment before answering. The state environmental office called yesterday, she said. They're scheduling a property inspection next month. That's normal, I replied. Normal? Rachel repeated. They're going to walk the entire forest and check for compliance with the conservation agreement. Do you know how much paperwork they sent me? I leaned back in the seat. I remembered the first time I received those inspection notices. The letters were thick envelopes filled with instructions, checklists, and deadlines. Did you read the conservation agreement? I asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Then she said something quieter. I didn't think it mattered that much. Of course she hadn't. Rachel had spent the entire lawsuit arguing about ownership. She had never asked what ownership actually involved. They also mentioned erosion control along the North Hillside. She continued. And something about wildlife monitoring reports. Yes, I said. Those are part of the program. Rachel let out another frustrated breath. You knew about all of this. Yes. And you didn't think to warn me. All the documents were in the estate files. That's not the same thing, she snapped. I waited a moment before responding. What did your lawyer say? Rachel hesitated again. He's still going through everything. That answer didn't surprise me. Whitaker had only started reading the paperwork after the inheritance transfer was finalized. Rachel continued talking before I could say anything else. And the developer isn't interested anymore, she said bitterly. What developer? The one I told you about. Her voice carried a mix of anger and embarrassment. They reviewed the conservation agreement. Apparently the land can't be developed the way we thought. Of course it couldn't. That restriction had been the entire point of the agreement. So the sale fell through, I asked. There is no sale, Rachel replied. I heard something in her voice then. Not just frustration. Something closer to realization. And that's not the only problem, she added. The cooperative families have been calling all week. I smiled slightly to myself. They're getting ready for the next season. They expect me to manage everything, Rachel said. They're asking about equipment maintenance and permits and production schedules. I don't know anything about that. For years I had coordinated those same details. Early morning phone calls. Paperwork filed before deadlines. Conversations with families who depended on that work to support themselves. Rachel had never seen any of it. She only saw the property itself. I thought you wanted control of the inheritance, I said quietly. That's not what this is, Rachel replied. What did you think it was? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller. I thought it was just land. The mountains around me were silent. Trees stretched across the hills in every direction, thick with summer leaves. The Mercer Forest looked peaceful from a distance, but anyone responsible for protecting it knew how much work it required. Rachel spoke again. Can you at least explain how the compliance reports work? The question caught me off guard. Rachel had not asked me for help in years. Most of our conversations ended long before either of us could say something useful. You're asking me to help you manage the property, I said. I'm asking you how you handled it, she replied. I thought about the years I spent keeping the estate running. The paperwork, the inspections, the endless small decisions required to keep the land protected. You wanted the inheritance, I said. Rachel's voice grew quiet again. I didn't understand what I was asking for. That might have been the closest thing to an apology Rachel had ever given me. She asked one final question before the call ended. Did you know this would happen? I considered the question honestly. I knew you didn't understand the responsibilities. I said. Rachel didn't respond. The line went silent. After a few seconds, the call disconnected. I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the wind move through the trees along the roadside. Rachel had fought hard to win the Mercer inheritance. Now she was beginning to see what came with it. Ownership had never been the difficult part. Carrying the weight of it was. 3 months after the court ruling, I stood on a ridge outside Boone watching the wind move slowly through a valley of protected forest. A group of landowners gathered behind me near a pickup truck, studying a stack of documents spread across the hood. They had invited me to explain how conservation agreements worked before they finalized their own property plans. One of the men pointed toward the tree line. "So once we sign this," he asked, "what exactly are we responsible for?" It was a question I had answered many times over the years, but hearing someone ask it before signing anything still felt refreshing. "It means the land stays protected," I said. "You'll file annual environmental reports, allow inspections, and maintain the ecosystem the way the agreement requires." Another woman looked down at the paperwork. "And if we ignore those obligations, the state won't ignore them," I replied. There was a quiet pause as they absorbed the answer. None of them looked surprised. They expected responsibility to come with ownership. That was the difference. Most people who truly cared about land asked questions first. Rachel had never asked those questions. She had only asked how much the property might be worth. When the meeting ended, I walked back toward my car parked along the gravel road. The mountains stretched endlessly around the valley, layers of blue ridges fading into the distance. For a long time, the Mercer land had been my entire world. Now it was simply another forest somewhere beyond those hills. My phone rang just as I reached the car. The name on the screen made me pause. Dad. He almost never called me directly. I answered. "Hello." His voice sounded tired. "How's your work going?" he asked. "Good," I said. There was a short silence before he continued. "Rachel's having a rough time with the property." I leaned against the car door. "What happened?" "The state inspection report came back," he said. "They're requiring erosion control work along the north hillside before winter." That didn't surprise me. The hillside had been vulnerable for years. Without proper stabilization, the soil would eventually slide toward the lower forest line. Dad continued. "They also say the farmhouse foundation needs repairs sooner than expected." I remembered the engineer's report I had filed months earlier. The old house had been slowly settling into the ground for decades. Stabilizing it was expensive but necessary. "How much did they estimate?" I asked. He told me the number. It was almost identical to the estimate I had seen last year. Dad sighed quietly. "She thought the land would make her rich," he said. "Turns out it just keeps asking for money." I didn't respond. For years I had tried to explain those realities to everyone in the family. But explanations meant nothing until people experienced the responsibility themselves. "She's been dealing with the cooperative families too," he added. "They expect her to organize the next harvest season." I pictured the maple grove behind the farmhouse. Dozens of trees lined with sap tubing. Workers arriving before sunrise during the coldest weeks of winter. Those families depended on that work every year. Rachel had never been involved in coordinating it. Dad's voice softened. "You handled more than we realized." The admission hung quietly in the air. For most of my life I had heard the opposite. That I was controlling the property. That I kept too much authority over the estate. Now the work behind that authority was impossible to ignore. "Rachel asked if you might help explain some of the environmental reports," he said carefully. I watched a hawk circle slowly above the valley. For years, helping the property had meant helping my family. But the situation was different now. The inheritance belonged to Rachel, and so did everything attached to it. "I think she'll figure it out," I said. Dad didn't argue. He just sighed again. A few days later, Rachel called me herself. Her voice sounded calmer than the last time we spoke. "I didn't understand what you were dealing with all those years," she said. That was the closest she had ever come to admitting anything. The inspections, the contractors, the reports, it never stops. "No," I said. "It doesn't." Rachel hesitated before continuing. "I thought you were controlling everything." I waited. "But you were holding everything together," she finished. The words felt strange coming from her. For years she had believed the Mercer property gave me power. Now she understood what it had actually required. "Do you regret letting me take it?" she asked suddenly. I looked across the valley again. The wind moved through the trees like a quiet wave rolling across the mountains. For a long time I believed losing the inheritance meant losing something important. But standing there, with new work and new opportunities ahead of me, I realized the truth. Letting go of that land had given me something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. "No," I said. Rachel was silent for a moment. I guess I deserved the lesson, she said quietly. Maybe we both did. After the call ended, I stood beside the car for a while longer. My grandmother used to say something when we walked through the forest together. Land doesn't belong to the person who wants it, she told me once. It belongs to the person willing to care for it. For years I had carried that responsibility because I believed someone had to. Now Rachel had the chance to decide whether she was willing to carry it too. Sometimes revenge doesn't come from taking something back. Sometimes it comes from letting someone hold exactly what they asked for, and realizing what it actually weighs. If you were in my place, would you have warned your family before the court ruling? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let them discover the truth on their own? I'd really like to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in that situation. And if stories like this interest you, stories about family drama, hidden truths, and the moment karma quietly turns the tables, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are many more stories still to come.